Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And we just want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who took the time to listen to last week's episode about Teresa Corley. It was our first time reaching out to a family member of a victim, and we feel very grateful that our work on it was well received and will help spread the word about Teresa's case. As we move forward, we really want to focus on these sometimes stagnant and lesser known cases in the New England area, and sometimes we're at a disadvantage because of that. There are instances where we found a truly compelling story, but because we're unable to uncover enough information on it, we have to set it aside for the time being. Even so, we believe that all of these tragedies deserve to be heard and eventually solved, and with more eyes on them and more people speaking about them, that's more likely to happen. We really want to hear what you guys think about the cases we're covering. That way we can speculate together on what we all think might have occurred. More brains are better than just our two, and we'd love to know your opinions. Maybe you agree with our theories, or maybe you've come up with an entirely different one, and if you put it out there, it could get to the right person and help close a case. Leave us a comment on any of our socials, or even shoot us an email with your thoughts. We're always open to suggestions on what you'd like to have covered, and if you have firsthand knowledge of something and would like to talk about it, we'll be happy to listen. But with that, let's move on to today's case. It revolves around a pair of high school sweethearts who were married for nearly 40 years, living what one could only assume was an idyllic life. But when their bodies were discovered in their mansion, amongst an execution-style murder scene left nearly spotless, police would need to dig into the couple's past to search for why this happened, and even more importantly, who's responsible. Today's case is about the murder of Jack and Jerry Magee. Geraldine and John Magee Jr., known by their friends and loved ones as Jerry and Jack, were high school sweethearts who met in Arlington, Massachusetts. Their love continued to grow as the years passed, and they eventually married on February 19, 1972, later having two children, Holly and John III. Jack appeared to have been a hard worker for what seems like his entire adult life. After high school, he attended Boston University, where he obtained a business degree, then making his way to New England School of Law a few years later. Once completing his studies there and assumably passing the bar, he was listed as a lawyer in the state of Massachusetts. However, in 1974, instead of practicing law, Jack made the decision to take over his father's reputable and, quite frankly, very profitable construction company, Magee Construction. Back in 1951, Jack's father, John Sr., incorporated the business and went on to generate a reputable name for the company. They built mostly single-family homes in the Boston and surrounding areas and were extremely successful. Through their dealings, Jack became very friendly with the building departments, subcontractors, and other individuals working in the area within this real estate development type business. Many people who knew him said Jack was friendly and upbeat, claiming he would make friends everywhere he'd go. This wasn't the type of business you could be a hard ass in, at least in my opinion. You've got to be a schmoozer, you know? Make people laugh a little, have a good time. And I think that's what made Jack so successful. The ADA later assigned to the Magee's case, Jonathan Blodgett, even goes on to say that Jack was a, quote, fair and honest businessman who paid his subcontractors on time and treated the people who worked for him and with him well. He was well respected and well liked by friends, business associates, and acquaintances, end quote. There unfortunately isn't a ton of information out there about who Jerry was as a person in the earlier days of her life, but I did locate one article on Patch.com that stated, quote, she was a devoted grandmother and was a member of St. Teresa's Church in North Reading. She volunteered for various organizations, including the Bread and Roses Community Pantry in Lawrence. She especially enjoyed traveling and had visited 6 continents and close to 40 countries, end quote. As I was researching this case, anytime I came across a picture of the couple, I just kept thinking about how they looked so happy and like a great family. They're beaming at the camera in nearly every photo I've seen of the two. As time went on, Jack's decision to take over the family business, rather than practice law, would prove fruitful, as the Magees would become very wealthy over the years. In 1986, they went on to build their new home at 7 Orchard Crossing in Andover, Massachusetts. Now, this wasn't some quaint little cabin. It was a freaking mansion, valued at over $1 million at the time. As I was researching, it seemed as though there was a lot of misreporting regarding the size of the home, its worth, and the property size. But I did some digging of my own and found, at least based on public property records, that the home is just under 10,000 square feet, even more when including the partially finished basement, situated on an almost 2-acre lot. Based on aerial footage of the property itself, it was not totally private and secluded, but definitely sat further back from the road, which was located just off Route 28. The couple lived there from 1986 when they built it until their deaths in 2011. The property was later sold in 2014 for $1.5 million. I can only imagine that the tragedy which occurred inside made it difficult to find a buyer for its full value. On Wednesday, December 14th, 2011, the couple's daughter, Holly, made her way over to the Magee's Andover mansion with her 2 children in tow. The kids, 4 and 8 years old at the time, would be staying with them for a bit so she could have some time to finish up her last-minute Christmas shopping. But when the 3 entered the home, they were met with panic and horror as they discovered both Jack and Jerry Magee dead on the ground in a pool of blood, lying head to head. Overcoming her initial shock, Holly calls 911. It's reported that the 911 call was placed at approximately 9:19 a.m. She explained to the dispatcher that her parents had been killed and she needed police right away. According to an article I found on yahoo.com, it states, quote, "In the initial police log entry for the incident, a police dispatcher noted, 'They are lying on the ground with blood coming out. She, the daughter, believes they are beyond any help,' end quote." I'm sure Holly must have been racking her brain, trying to think of how or why this could have happened, all the while sheltering her little ones from seeing anything further. The day prior had seemed totally normal. According to those that knew the Magees, Tuesday, December 13th was like any other day. Jack was running Magee Construction as he always did. However, at this point in time, he'd begun starting the process to hand over the torch to his son John and work towards his retirement, just as his father before him had done. It's reported that on December 13th, Jack had visited one of his construction sites located on Sailor Tom's Way in Reading, Massachusetts. Reading was about a town or two south of where he lived, so it was only about a 20-minute drive to get to the construction site. It appears as though Magee Construction was working on a new development in Reading, and Jack was tasked with building several new homes, so he'd stop by to check on the progress being made. While there, Jack called his son and let him know he was going to need to carve out time the following day to pick up some additional building materials for the project, and those materials were located in Boston. Once he completed his overview of the progress at the Reading location, it's reported that an employee working at the site had assisted Jack in clearing out his truck so that he could have it free of any items for the next day, as John would be using that same truck to pick up those materials in Boston. After that, he left the construction site around 3 p.m. and presumably headed back home to Andover. As Jack was doing his thing, Jerry was at home with John, who was working out of their basement office at 7 Orchard Crossing. Jerry spoke to her daughter Holly around 4:30 p.m. and had the conversation about bringing the kids over the next morning. This was a fairly common occurrence, Jerry watching the grandkids, so of course she obliged. She loved spending time with them. While the conversation between Jerry and Holly is going on, John was packing up from his day's work and getting ready to head home. Holly later mentioned to investigators that she remembered hearing what she believed to be her dad, Jack, talking in the background while she was chatting with her mom, leading her to believe that he'd already made his way home from the worksite in Reading. I think it's important to note that she believed her father to be there around this time because there's not much other information out there regarding the whereabouts of Jack and Jerry the rest of that evening. So when putting together a timeline, this may be the only account of where Jack could have been after leaving Reading. The only thing that may throw this off is if Holly mistook John's voice as he was leaving, thinking it was her dad. Depending on if Jack was already home, this could be a key missing event in the timeline that could help piece things together. So after John left the house around 4:30 and Holly hangs up with Jerry, we don't know what the Magees were up to. They could have spent the night at home, gone out to dinner, ran some errands. It's all still a mystery.
Well, wouldn't police just ask John if his dad was there when he had left?
That's a great question, and one I had myself. I would assume that police have specifically asked John this, but they've never gone on to release the answer.
Doesn't seem to me like they want to release anything.
I know, it's beyond frustrating, but I'm sure they've told the family that it'd be best to keep certain information from the public in order to maintain the integrity of the investigation. But all we know for sure is that Jerry was alive around 4:30 and Jack was either home or heading home, only to be found murdered roughly 16 hours later. Once the 911 call came in, authorities arrived on scene almost immediately and began their investigation. It appears that at some point early on, police placed the surrounding area on lockdown while setting up a perimeter. One could imagine that even while living in a wealthy neighborhood like Orchard Crossing, seeing so many police would be cause for concern, especially once neighbors found out what had happened. Police came forward fairly quickly, though, telling the public that they believed the murders to be a, quote, isolated incident and that they had nothing to fear.
Yeah, I can't say that would make me feel any better if I lived nearby, though.
I know, I'm in the same boat you are. I mean, come on, anyone would be freaked out if their neighbors were killed and the person who did it hadn't been apprehended yet. In one respect, I can understand why police would put out a statement like this. You don't want to cause mass hysteria, but I have to question, how could they know so quickly that this was an isolated incident? I think it'd be pretty irresponsible of them to make that claim, not knowing full well that it were true.
Yeah, I can't imagine that they'd put out something like that without being pretty certain about it.
Even so, I'd still be scrutinizing every person I see walking down my street. Doors locked, windows locked, security system armed.
Knife equipped.
Yes, boot knife sheathed and ready to deploy. Anyway, as police continued their investigation over the next month, information about the couple's death was released to the public. In an article in the Eagle Tribune, it states, quote, in January 2012, 2 death certificates from the state's medical examiner's office asserted that John, Jack, died of gunshot wounds to the head, neck, and chest from one or possibly more assailants over a period of seconds. Geraldine was killed by a single shot to the head, end quote. It also appears as though they may have been laid down prior to being shot, as the rounds had gone through the floor and into the basement of the home. Based on my research, it seems as though police were unable to locate any of the shell casings from the scene, which seems to be an important fact going forward. Police also went on to state that there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no indication that this was a planned robbery or one that had gone bad. Knowing these facts, one could be led to believe a number of scenarios. Did the Magees leave their doors unlocked, giving the intruders easy access?
I don't know. I doubt they'd leave their $1 million home unlocked on the regular.
Sure, I was thinking the same thing, so then I started wondering, did Jack and Jerry perhaps know the killers then? They could have let them in, totally unsuspecting of what was going to happen.
It's possible, especially with there being no forced entry, but why would someone they know want them dead?
That's the issue with this particular case. Police come out claiming it's an isolated incident, but keep everything else regarding the suspects, if there even are any, hidden from the public. There's no assurances as to what happened, but so much speculation.
Yeah, it's a frustrating thing not having answers, but just because there's so much unknown doesn't mean that these people shouldn't be talked about.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So let's keep going with what we know and what's been theorized. There was one thing that stuck out to me regarding the idea that those responsible could have known the Magees. Jack and Jerry had a dog, and that dog was left totally unharmed. In a video I watched on necn.com, the neighbors stated that the Magees' dog was barking for most of that Tuesday night, December 13th. They stated that their dog never barked, so this was totally out of the ordinary. So then that leads me to speculate that maybe the dog being left alive is of importance?
I'm not sure if that's indicative of the killers knowing Jack and Jerry, but it is interesting. I'm sure the dog had some sense of what had happened, and that's why it was barking. It being left alive, though, certainly makes you think.
Right? I mean, I do always like to play devil's advocate, and for all we know, maybe they kept the dog crated. If they'd left the house that night and maybe were ambushed when they came home, the dog could have still been in the crate and had no means of attempting to get at the killer. Therefore, what would be the point of harming the dog then? But on the other hand, you'd assume that if this was some random person hired to kill the Magees, they probably wouldn't care about the dog. They'd most likely just kill it too, so it wouldn't make a racket and then get them caught.
I don't know. The lack of details released by police make it difficult to really gauge what I think at this point. The dog being left alive could have been for any number of reasons. Like you said, it could have been crated or locked away in another room. But regardless of the situation with the dog, one thing you said caught my attention. That there were no shell casings left at the scene and that Jack and Jerry may have been laying down when they were shot. Hearing that, it starts to make you think that this was professional and, like we've been kind of alluding to, that there could have been multiple people involved. Nothing valuable stolen, no shell casings, no forced entry, victims killed right next to each other with bullet holes in the floor. The people who did this seemed to know what they were doing.
I'm with you, but I want to touch on something you said about no valuables stolen. That brings me to what we find out about the Magee's car. Investigators would go on to locate the Magee's black Lexus SUV on Prince Street in the north end of Boston, around 10 p.m. the night before their bodies were found. This location was nearly 25 miles from their home, or a 30 to 35 minute drive, and the condition in which the vehicle was left in was pretty sus. Their vehicle was found engulfed in flames. What could this mean? Why wasn't the car at their home? Did whoever killed them take their car as a getaway vehicle?
Okay, my first thought is, how did nobody go to the Magee's house to check on them after finding their car burnt to a crisp? That'd be one of the first things police would do after identifying the registered owner. But aside from that, and I may be way off here, these are hallmarks of a professional hit, probably by two people. My theory, at least right now, is that the killers must have parked their own car somewhere away from the Magee's house, but close enough to walk the rest of the way there.
And then what? They lied in wait until they had an opportunity to enter the home?
Exactly. I'd think that two suspects would have made it easier to force Jack and Jerry to comply with their orders without some type of struggle. Then, after killing them, the suspects hopped into the Magee's vehicle, drove to pick up the other one they came in, and then drove the Lexus to Boston. Then they torched it to destroy any evidence they may have left inside.
Well, let's elaborate on the whole two-suspect idea. The first thing that got me thinking along those same lines was that Jack and Jerry were found laying down, head-to-head, with bullet holes in the floor. From everything we've seen through various types of media over our lifetimes, when something like this happens, the victims are usually placed on their knees prior to being shot. It seems much more feasible that two people were involved in doing so. You'd have to be pretty dang intimidating to make these two grown adults drop to their knees and basically just wait to be killed with just one person committing this murder. Sure, I understand that the Magees were in their late 60s, but from all the photos we've seen of them together, they didn't appear feeble in any way. If this was a planned hit, you'd have to assume that whoever organized it wanted to ensure that it wasn't bumbled. Two perps would make this more of a sure thing, not only with respect to controlling the Magees, but also while assisting in the removal of evidence afterwards. And then the car. I think the car is key. John's theory of the killers using the Magees' vehicle for their getaway makes sense, but how would they have gotten there in the first place? I doubt it was one person being dropped off, especially after learning that the Magees' Lexus was driven to Boston and lit on fire. How would the suspect who drove that get out of the area? Just walk on foot? It seems more likely that a second person followed them, and after setting the fire, they hopped in with them and fled.
Yeah, to me, the signs point towards two people being involved.
I was also thinking about something else in regards to how these killers got into the house without forced entry. Like we talked about earlier, Holly had made mention that she believed she heard her father in the background while talking to Jerry. What if she had been mistaken, and Jack wasn't home yet? Could he have been followed from Reading or another place he'd stopped along the way? Then, if he hadn't gotten home until after John left, the killers could have followed him up to the door and forced him inside. If there were two people in the car trailing him, this could explain how they got there and the availability of a second vehicle for the getaway from the car fire after they stole the Magees' Lexus. And police have gone on to note that the front door had been unlocked. I assume that Holly must have told them this.
The door being unlocked sure makes it seem like whoever was responsible could have caught Jack while he was entering the home.
For all we know, either of these could be the most probable at this point, but we still need to figure out why somebody would want to do this. From everybody that knew the Magees, they all said they were great people. As police continue their investigation, they've worked tirelessly to find answers. Their potential leads have taken them to over 20 different cities and towns in and around the Boston area, as well as 4 states outside of Massachusetts. One state in particular was Florida, where the Magees owned a second home in Jupiter that they'd bought back in 2003. It appears that this was their retirement plan after passing the business down to John. When asked, authorities refused to comment on whether or not their ties to Florida had anything to do with the murders. While scouring these varied locations, authorities have, of course, searched all things belonging to the Magees for any clues: their homes, vehicles, computers, and also their financial records. They conducted tons of interviews with employees of Magee Construction and family and friends in order to get a good picture of their life and try to formulate an idea of why this may have happened. But even with all this legwork they'd put in, authorities remained tight-lipped about almost all of the specifics.
Except that the community need not worry, because this must have been some type of targeted assassination.
Very true. But targeted by who? As I dug for answers, it appears as though there are two different avenues people go down when speculating on this case. I'll give you a rundown of both and what I think. So, the first one is similar to what you believe, John, that it was a professional hit or maybe even mob-related. The second being that this was a crime committed by someone close to the family and that they staged it to look professional in order to lead police in a different direction. Now, my first thought with the whole staging is, do people really think police are that dumb? I mean, there have got to be certain investigative techniques in place to avoid crap like that happening, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I don't know about the whole staging thing. If the Magees were found in a pool of blood, they weren't killed until they were in that spot, so there's no real staging of the bodies. If someone they knew was involved, I'd have to think that it's because they were the ones who ordered the hit, not because they did it themselves and then tried to mastermind some type of cover-up.
I totally agree with what you're saying regarding staging the bodies, but that's not what came up as necessarily what people believe was staged when I was researching. The thing that people get more hung up on is the car. Was it a total red herring and burned for no real reason? Perhaps just used as a distraction to send police looking into something that wasn't really that important.
It could have been, but I think that's a lot of added risk just to try and distract investigators. They'd have to be dodging traffic cameras and hoping that nobody saw them driving or fleeing after setting the blaze.
Very true. So with that, let's delve into the idea that this was a professional hit, mob-initiated or otherwise. First of all, we know this was a pretty clean crime scene. Aside from the bodies and blood, it appears as though there were very few clues left behind. It's never been released if there are fingerprints or DNA or anything of that nature, but we do know that whoever committed this crime took the shell casings with them and managed to do this while avoiding any type of struggle. Then, the execution-style killing. Both victims were shot at least one time in the head, with Jack also being shot in the chest and neck. To me, all of these line up pretty well with someone who had a plan and carried it out with little issue. Some people seem to think that Jack was the target and Jerry, being home with him, was essentially caught up in the mess.
So with this seemingly professional murder, how are people getting to the link of it being mob-related?
People seem to come to this conclusion for a few reasons. One being that because Jack was involved in real estate development and the mob supposedly had their hands in that type of stuff, that maybe he got himself unknowingly wrapped up with the wrong people and they in turn whacked him. Along with that, and what some believe to be the more important link to the mob, is what happened with the Magee's vehicle. The north end of Boston, where the car was found torched, is near an area known as Little Italy, which was supposedly a den of mob activity. Due to this, the press seemed to push pretty hard towards a mob connection.
Give me a break. Do we actually think that the mob is going to kill this couple and then lead police straight to Little Italy? That sounds pretty stupid to me. If anything, it seems more like something an enemy or a competitor to the mob would do.
I'm totally on board with that thought process. I don't think that this was mob-related, and if anything, what I think right off the bat is that this was someone else leaving the car here to make you think it's mob-related, but in reality, that's not the case at all. Between each of these theories, there are also people trying to bring symbolism into the equation. It's been said that because of the way Jack and Jerry's bodies were found, lying head-to-head, that this could have had some sort of deeper meaning. Now, I've tried to find anything proving this to be the case, but I cannot for the life of me come up with where they might have gotten this answer from.
I think that sometimes people look too deep into things and try to find something that's not really there. Now, I'm no savant when it comes to symbolism, but to me, this appears to have been two people placed on their knees and then shot, presumably from behind. Most execution-style killings are committed in this fashion as to put the victims in a vulnerable position to reduce the ability to fight back. Not everything has to be more than what it seems.
I totally agree. With cases like these, where you want answers but nothing has been released, you've got no choice but to let your mind wander, and sometimes it ends up leading you down paths that don't make a whole lot of sense. Still though, at least they get you thinking.
Speaking of mind wandering, we haven't even touched on the ballistics of this case yet. We know that the shell casings were taken from the home, but what about the bullet holes in the floor? Did police find the rounds from the gun? Were they in the basement or maybe even still in the Magee's bodies? If they had the rounds and tested them, then we would know if there were two different guns used and more than likely tell us if this was carried out by more than one person.
That's an awesome point to bring up. It's been mentioned that authorities have conducted an extensive investigation, so I'm sure they must know this by now. But since much of their work hasn't been released publicly, all we have are theories. The second, aside from this being conducted by hitmen, is that it was staged to appear as such, and that perhaps someone close to the Magees had murdered them. Now, I find this to be totally far-fetched, but What seems to attract people to this idea is the Lexus left ablaze in the North End. This seems to lead some to believe that because the vehicle was left in an area that's associated with the mob, that someone left it there purposefully to try and make that connection. But like we talked about earlier, it just doesn't make sense. Nobody responsible for this crime would leave evidence on their own doorstep, especially an organization that is already involved in, let's say, less than legal activity. Now, we've talked about how this might have happened and who may be responsible and the theories surrounding those two scenarios. But we need to get into why these two loving grandparents were murdered. Well, we learned some interesting information about some of Jack Magee's business dealings from around 8 years prior to his death. Back in 2003, there was apparently a situation regarding some land that the Magees owned that was improperly labeled at the tax assessor's office. According to the Magees, they were the rightful owners of nearly 17 acres along I-93 in Massachusetts, but it was marked as being owned by a family known as the Perkins. Clearly, this leads to some problems. Now comes Millis Corp, a company that wanted to buy the land to build a mall, but without knowing who the rightful owner of the property was, everything had to be put on hold. More than a year passed while the Magees and Perkins negotiated their way through the drama, eventually coming to an agreement. The situation would prove to be pretty messy, later being dubbed the, quote, Millis Mall fiasco. However, once everything was all said and done, it appears as though everyone involved was happy with the outcome. The Perkins family ended up paying the Magees over $1 million for ownership of the contested acreage. A friend of Jack's named Paul Mercadetti, who was his best friend and best man at his wedding, says that the dispute was, quote, equitably resolved, and that, quote, there were no hard feelings. Everything was on the up and up, end quote. After the Perkins family had legal ownership, they then sold the property to the Millis Corp. The weird thing about all of this, though, is that the company who started this whole kerfuffle never built anything and ended up going out of business in what's believed to have been around 2007. So, to me at least, I feel like this whole land dispute thing didn't have anything to do with their murders. Not only because of the resolution, which did seem pretty equitably resolved as Paul mentioned, that piece I can agree with, but also because of the year in which the dispute took place. 2003 was 8 years before the murders. I mean, damn, that'd be an awful long time to hold a grudge before taking some type of action. And quite honestly, what kind of grudge could even be held? The Perkins bought the land from the Magees and then turned right around and sold it to Millis Corp. Doesn't seem like anything happened here to piss anyone off enough to hire someone to kill Jack and Jerry.
Well, let's not move past this too quickly. The land appeared to be in the Perkins name. So let's say Millis Corp had a deal set up and ready to go with them, and then when Jack put up a stink, the dispute caused the project to be delayed. Could the delay have been what caused Millis Corp to go out of business after being unable to finish the project they had set out to do? I could picture someone involved there blaming Jack for what happened.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Millis Corp probably thought it was a done deal with the Perkins, only to then be blindsided when they found out there was an ownership issue over the land. Maybe someone could have had a lot of money riding on the mall being completed, and then when it fell through and Millis Corp went out of business, presumably after the housing crash, they held Jack responsible.
Exactly. That would have cut the time down to only 4 years prior to the murders, and who's to say that Jack wasn't being harassed or threatened during that in-between time?
Well, we can tell that he wasn't the type to back down from a confrontation. When he knew that land was his, he fought for it. So I'd guess that he'd handle harassment the same way and deal with it himself, maybe telling people to F off. We know that Jack had both an undergrad business degree and a law degree, so I think that likely helped with his business ventures and knowing the rules and laws surrounding any financial arrangements he got himself into. So he could have probably ran circles around some lesser-informed people working in that field. It doesn't seem like he'd be the type to end up in a shady business deal, stuck under the thumb of someone else. He'd been a successful business owner for essentially 4 decades. It didn't appear as though they were in any debt. They barely even had a mortgage on their house. So maybe you're right, and this whole land dispute thing followed him longer than expected. On web sleuths and Reddit, you can find people saying that they think John III could have had something to do with his parents' death. That perhaps he hadn't been happy with some of Jack's business decisions he'd made during the transition prior to handing over the company. But I think these assumptions are totally off base. There's absolutely no indication that Jack and John had anything other than a great relationship in both work and family life. I think people like to just latch on to anything, regardless of its significance, and try and stir up drama where none needs to be stirred up. But after all of this information I've thrown at you, I want to move on to what we think happened here. I think overall, the idea that this was a professional hit is pretty probable. Personally, I really don't think that the Magees had any involvement with the mob like I mentioned before, at least not voluntarily. People seem to really try and tie the fact that he was in the development business and very successful in it, that could have tied him to the mob as they were heavy into that business in the area. But there really isn't any evidence to prove that. What I really think happened here is that Jack had gotten himself into some sort of argument or dispute with someone over something financially related and maybe just pissed off the wrong person. I think it's clear that he was a smart businessman and knew what he was doing, and maybe someone was trying to pull one over on him and he wasn't going to have that. So then they went ahead and hired someone to kill him to get him out of the way of whatever situation they were in. Regarding how I think it happened, I already made it pretty clear what I thought to be the most realistic theory, and that's that someone was lying in wait for the couple and surprised them at their home. Honestly, I think the biggest thing here that would help us to really hone in on what happened would be knowing about the Magee's financials. There's gotta be more information that the police know that they're not telling the public. And trust me, I get it. They don't want to hinder their investigation by letting out the wrong info. I just feel like if this case ever gets solved, which I truly hope it does, that we'll find out it had something to do with a financial mess, and maybe one that Jack didn't even realize he'd gotten himself into. There certainly could have been other people in the real estate development business who had nefarious connections, even if Jack was unaware of them. But I think the main motivation behind what motivated the person who did this has to do with money. Most people kill over money, at least that's what it seems like to me. Holly and her brother John, along with other family and friends of Gerry and Jack Magee, have suffered for the past 10 years not knowing who's responsible for killing their loved ones. Jack's best friend Paul told the Boston Globe, quote, "I have searched my soul, but I can't think of a single person who could have a grudge against them, and if there was anything going on, he would have told me," end quote. He also goes on to state, quote, "They're the nicest people you are ever going to see. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's just insane," end quote. Paul also mentioned that he had just had breakfast with Jack a few days before he was killed and stated that he seemed totally fine. That is yet another comment that leads me to believe that Jack was none the wiser of a potential nefarious connection in his financial world. Jack's son John has since renamed Magee Construction after taking ownership, naming it Millbrook Building Corp., and it appears as though he currently runs the business with his wife. I can understand the name change, wanting to move forward, almost as a fresh start, and trying to remove the stigma that was brought on by what happened to his parents. To this day, over a decade after the murders, police are still pretty quiet about any specifics and have stated that they will never publicly label anyone as a person of interest or a suspect until they've arrested and charged them. So I don't believe we'll know much more until an arrest is made in this case, which is unfortunate. Maybe with additional information released to the public, it might jog someone's memory to come forward.
I wonder if police are thinking that the suspects are linked to some type of high-profile individual, and that's why they don't want to release any information until they make an arrest.
I could see that being the case here. As crappy as it is, and as much as the public wants to know, I can understand why police keep radio silence in regards to what they've learned. It's clear based on statements from those involved that they've done their due diligence in this investigation, and it's possible that only those with first-hand knowledge of what occurred could provide valuable information. On the 10th anniversary of the Magee murders, the family put out a statement that I want to read for you. It states, quote, "It's been almost 10 years since the tragic deaths of Jack and Gerry Magee. Our family has lost 10 years of love, smiles, wisdom, support, and happiness with them. For the past decade, we've hoped and prayed for answers and closure to this horrible crime. We hope that the 10-year commemoration of this terrible event will encourage those who have information on this crime to come forward. The time is now, and this injustice should not continue. We support the authorities in their investigation and hope that they'll be able to bring this case to a clear conclusion soon. Jack and Gerry will live forever in our hearts and memories. But the people who committed this act are still at large, and they need to be brought to justice. We ask that anyone who has any knowledge of what happened to Jack and Gerry immediately come forward to the Andover Police Department. Please help us solve this crime," end quote. If you have any information regarding the murders of Geraldine and Jack Magee, please contact the Essex County District Attorney's Office at 978-745-8908 or the anonymous tip line for the Andover Police at 978-470-3864. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.